Needless to say, at the end of that match, I did knock out Vince McMahon. I broke two bones in my hand, and I knocked him out cold, and he went down.
At 60 years old, Bret Hart still names names. He still points fingers. And the 5 wrestlers he hated most are still front of mind every time someone puts a microphone in front of him. This is not a man who found peace and quietly walked away. This is a man who built his entire life around one idea. Wrestling should be done with skill, and it should be done safely. When the people around him failed that standard, he never let it go. Bret Hart was the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. That line was not just a catchphrase. For millions of fans around the world, it was the truth. He spent decades in that ring and never once deliberately put an opponent in real danger. That was his code. That was everything. But here is the part that makes the Bret Hart story so compelling. The man who stood for safety and professionalism above everything else ended up feeling stabbed in the back by the very people who defined his era. Not once, not twice, 5 times. 5 different men who each broke something he considered sacred. One of them refused to help build the next generation and protected his own spot at any cost. One crossed into personal territory and helped engineer the most infamous moment in wrestling history. One was a political operator who married into power and rewrote the story in his own favor. One was the boss who made enormous promises and broke every single one of them. And one threw a kick so reckless and careless that it stole $16 million and the rest of Bret Hart's career in a single second. At 60, Bret is not whispering these names. He is saying them out loud, on stage, in interviews, and in his own web series. The bitterness has not softened with age. If anything, it has sharpened into something precise and deliberate. So today we count them down. Number 5, all the way to number 1. The 5 wrestlers Bret Hart hated most, and exactly why each one earned a permanent place on that list. Number 5, Hulk Hogan. Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan should have had one of the greatest moments in wrestling history together. Instead, they had one of its most bitter and painful missed opportunities. And Bret has spent decades making sure nobody forgets why it fell apart and who was responsible for letting it collapse. By 1993, the WWF landscape was beginning to shift in important ways. The era that Hogan had dominated for nearly a decade was coming to a natural end, and Vince McMahon had made a clear and deliberate decision. It was time to build new stars for a new audience. Bret Hart was at the center of that plan. He had the championship. He had the respect of the entire locker room. So he was the man Vince had chosen to carry the company into the next chapter of its history. Then came WrestleMania 9. Bret lost the title that night to Yokozuna under circumstances that frustrated him deeply. And moments later, Hulk Hogan walked to the ring, accepted an impromptu challenge, and won the WWF Championship in a matter of seconds. Bret felt like he had been moved to one side before he even had a real chance to establish himself in the position he had been promised. But Vince made him a direct promise about what would come next. He told Bret that SummerSlam 1993 would be his moment. The plan was clear and it carried genuine weight. Bret Hart would face Hulk Hogan for the championship. He would force Hogan to submit to the sharpshooter. The torch would pass clearly and definitively on pay-per-view in front of millions. A new era beginning right there for the whole world to see. The kind of moment that only happens once and that fans remember for the rest of their lives as a turning point. Hogan said no. He refused to do the match at all. And the reason he offered was one that Bret Hart has never forgotten. Hogan claimed that Bret simply was not in his league. Those words cut deep, and they still do. Here was the biggest name in wrestling history looking directly at the man Vince McMahon had chosen as his successor and deciding that future was not worth his time or his willingness to look vulnerable. Bret confronted Hogan about it. After the King of the Ring that summer, Bret told Hogan exactly what he thought of him in the locker room. He called him a piece of garbage, directly to his face, in terms that left nothing open to interpretation. That level of raw and immediate anger tells you everything about how deep the wound went and how personal the rejection felt. For Bret, this was never just about one match being removed from a pay-per-view card. It was about what Hogan represented as a professional and as a person. Hart had always understood that veterans owed something real to the generation behind them, a clear and deliberate passing of the baton, a signal to the audience that the next person deserves your belief and your investment. Bret himself would later fulfill that duty for Steve Austin at WrestleMania 13, losing in a way that turned Austin into a genuine megastar through nothing but storytelling and craft. He understood the responsibility because he believed in it. Hogan, in his eyes refused to even acknowledge it existed. The ripple effect of that refusal went beyond the summer of 1993. Without a clean and definitive passing of the torch, Bret's position as the face of the WWF remained complicated for longer than it should have. Audiences had seen him lose the title, seen Hogan sweep in and take it, and never received the visual confirmation that Bret had genuinely superseded the old era. That confirmation had been planned for SummerSlam. Hogan took it off the table. For Bret, the cost of that decision echoed through the next several years of his career in ways that were difficult to fully measure, but impossible to miss. The resentment did not stay inside the WWF. When Bret signed with World Championship Wrestling in 1997, he was hoping for a genuine fresh start and a new stage to show what he could do. Instead, he believes Hogan and Eric Bischoff worked in tandem to ensure WCW never did anything meaningful or significant with him at all during his time there. Hogan held a creative control clause in his WCW contract. That clause gave him substantial influence over his own storylines and over who his opponents would be and how the matches around him would be booked. Bret believes that influence was used against him systematically and deliberately throughout his entire WCW run. Instead of the spotlight and the feuds he deserved, Bret found himself drifting through the program without genuine purpose or forward momentum of any kind. Their eventual match on Monday, Nitro in 1998, should have been a landmark event in wrestling history. Two of the biggest names the sport had ever produced, finally in the same ring together in a proper featured match. Instead, the match was a mess with no clean finish and no logical structure behind the booking. Bret describes it as a travesty that came to nothing and left no lasting impression on anyone who watched it. He places the blame squarely on the political environment surrounding the booking for killing whatever potential it once held. By the time Bret reached 60, any warmth he once felt toward Hogan had disappeared entirely and permanently. He calls him a bullshitter and a roadblock, someone who spent decades constructing a version of himself that did not match the reality of how he actually conducted himself. Someone who, when the moment came to help the business move forward into its future, chose his own position every single time without hesitation or visible regret. Hogan's public comments in the period following Owen Hart's passing added another permanent layer to the bitterness between them. Bret perceived those remarks as using his brother's death to continue a personal grudge. That perception sealed his opinion of the man beyond any possibility of change or rehabilitation. If Hogan taught Bret what selfishness looks like, then 1997 taught him what betrayal feels like. Number 4, Shawn Michaels. Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels were the two finest in-ring workers of their generation. Both of them knew it, and neither of them ever needed to say it out loud because it was simply understood. There was a mutual recognition between them that went beyond ordinary professional respect. If you wanted to see professional wrestling performed at its absolute ceiling in the 1990s, you watched these two men. They were peers in the truest and most complete sense of the word, each one the only person who could genuinely match what the other was capable of. But by 1997, that recognition had been buried under layers of personal hostility that neither of them could see past or see through. And by the time everything arrived at its conclusion in Montreal, what had started as competitive friction between two elite performers had turned into something deeply personal and completely unforgettable for the history of the sport. Their relationship had always carried natural tension underneath the surface. They were competing for the same position at the very top of the card. Different styles, different personalities, different visions for what the business should look like. But things stayed in a professional space for a long time. A kind of cold mutual acknowledgement that the other person was elite, even if they were not friends and never would be. Then Shawn Michaels made a move that dissolved the line between what was scripted and what was real. The moment was the Sunny Days promo. Shawn stood in front of a live television audience and insinuated with full deliberateness and a knowing expression that Bret Hart was having an affair with a manager known as Sonny. It was broadcast to millions of viewers. Bret's wife and his family were watching. His children were watching. Bret had a complicated personal history of his own that he has since acknowledged openly. But that was not the point, and Shawn understood clearly that it was not the point. The point was that Shawn had taken aim at his real life, in public, with cameras rolling, with full knowledge of what he was doing and what damage it would cause. Bret viewed it as a calculated move designed to destroy his marriage and humiliate him in the most visible way possible. That is not a locker room prank or competitive ribbing. That is a weapon aimed deliberately at a family. The response came on June 9, 1997, in Hartford. Bret confronted Shawn backstage and physically ripped out a substantial chunk of his hair in a confrontation that left nothing ambiguous about where things stood. Whatever fragile professional boundary had still been separating their rivalry from something uglier and more personal was now gone completely and permanently. From that point, both men knew exactly where they stood. And with the Survivor Series in Montreal approaching, approaching in November, with Bret as WWF champion and his imminent departure to WCW on the horizon, the conditions were fully set for the moment that would rewrite both their legacies and alter the history of the business in ways that are still being discussed decades later. Bret has spoken about what that Survivor Series match was supposed to be, a 25-minute technical showcase, sequences they had carefully prepared together that had never been attempted on live television before. He was genuinely proud of what they had built and excited about what they were going to deliver. Even through the personal hatred between them, the professional in Bret still wanted to give the audience something extraordinary that night. That is who he was. Instead, the Montreal Screwjob happened. The referee rang the bell while Bret was applying his own finishing hold. The title was stripped from him without his knowledge or his consent. He had been told by Vince McMahon that he could leave Montreal as champion, that he could even forfeit the belt on his own terms if necessary. None of that was honored in any way. Bret calls Shawn a scumbag for plotting against him, while presenting himself as a professional peer who would return the favor of a title loss fairly. Shawn had given every clear impression that he would handle the situation the right way. Bret took him at his word. He should not have. Shawn Michaels has spoken about that period in his own way across the years. He has admitted that he and the group around him at that time were, in his own words, pretty darn bad. He has said that growing up around chaos means chaos does not bother you as much. After Montreal, he has said what he mostly cared about was what The Undertaker thought of the situation. Not the wider locker room, not the people who had been deceived. Just one person's verdict on the night. To Bret, that admission reveals exactly the character behind all the maneuvering. They reconciled officially in 2010. Bret has said that reconciliation was genuine, and he stands by it. But his assessment of who Shawn was during 1997 has not shifted at all. He maintains that Shawn and Triple H used their combined influence during the Click era to bully a young Dwayne Johnson who was still finding his footing in the company. Bret went out of his way to defend The Rock when it was not easy to do so. He contrasts that with how Shawn and Triple H operated when the power was in their hands. The respect for Shawn's talent survives entirely intact. The respect for how he conducted himself in 1997 does not survive at all. But Bret never believed Shawn pulled that trigger alone. Number 3, Triple H. If Shawn Michaels is the most emotionally complicated name on this list, Triple H is the most contemptuous. Bret does not discuss him with the layered mix of bitterness and residual respect he carries for Shawn. He talks about Triple H with something closer to pure professional dismissal, a settled, cold disdain that has not changed or softened across the years. And at 60, those feelings have only hardened further. The criticism begins with the work itself. Bret rated Triple H 4 out of 10. Across multiple live events and interviews during his 60th year reflections, he stated clearly that he never saw a single Triple H match that he would call great, not one. In a career built entirely on the belief that excellence inside the ring was the only currency that truly mattered, that is the lowest possible verdict from the most demanding possible judge. He views Triple H as a competent worker who was elevated far beyond what his actual ability deserved. Someone who found a shortcut considerably more effective than hard work and years of craft built match by match in arenas all over the world. And that shortcut, in Bret's telling, was the McMahon family and everything that came with being close to them. The critique Bret returns to most often is about originality. He says Triple H never had an original idea for anything, that everything he accomplished once he attained real backstage power was material he effectively wrote for himself once the access and the control were in his hands. Bret has said with pointed and deliberate bitterness that he wishes he could have sat back in 1992 and simply scripted himself to win every title 500 times. He earned his position through work ethic and technical skill built over years of honest graft. In his view, Triple H earned very little of it honestly at all. Bret has used a specific line that captures the whole sentiment in a single thought. He has said openly and on record that Triple H is a phony who married the boss's daughter and then rode himself to the top through the access that relationship provided. He has said he just never thought Triple H was any good and that everything Triple H accomplished was stuff that he wrote out for himself once he had the control to make it happen. From a man who treats craft and earned respect as the most serious things in professional life, that kind of statement carries real and lasting weight. But the real heat comes from Montreal. Bret does not see Triple H as a background figure in the screwjob. He sees him as one of its chief architects. The version Bret believes is this: it was Triple H who told Vince McMahon that if Bret would not do business on his own, they would do business for him. That line sits at the core of Bret's contempt. The idea that someone who had not yet earned the standing to make that call gave the green light to betray a man who had built his entire reputation on loyalty and professional integrity. Bret calls it a slimeball move. He says so plainly and without any softening. He calls Triple H a phony and a slimeball in the same breath, because in his mind, those two qualities are not separate. The phoniness in public and the willingness to operate in the shadows against a colleague are the same instinct expressing itself in different circumstances. The locker room aftermath following the screw job is well documented. Bret punched Vince McMahon backstage, and nobody who witnessed it doubted for a moment why he did it. What is less often part of the public conversation is what Bret said about that night in 2025 at a live event. He stated openly that he wishes Triple H had been in that dressing room at the same moment. He believes that if he had knocked Triple H out cold right there, it might have altered the entire chain of events that followed. No consolidation of backstage power, no marriage to Stephanie McMahon, a completely different future for the company and for everyone inside it. He said it with total sincerity as a genuine reflection, not as theater. For Bret, Triple H represents a very specific kind of failure, the failure of meritocracy, the moment when proximity to the right people replaced the work itself as the route to the top. He cannot accept that. He never could. The craft was everything to him, and watching someone bypass the craft entirely and still arrive at the destination is something he cannot and will not reconcile. What makes this even more pointed for Bret is the contrast with his own journey. He grew up one of many Hart siblings in a family that lived and breathed wrestling. He was not handed anything. He earned every match, every opportunity, every title reign through work that was visible and measurable night after night. He was good enough that his opponents knew it and trusted him with their bodies. That is the version of success Bret Hart recognizes and respects. The version he believes Triple H benefited from is something else entirely. And at 60, he says so plainly every time someone asks. And then there is the man Bret trusted most of all, the man who could have stopped everything and chose not to. Number 2, Vince McMahon. Every name on this list carries genuine weight, but Vince McMahon carries a different kind entirely, because Bret did not simply work for Vince McMahon. He trusted him. He believed in him in a way that went well beyond what a professional arrangement usually contains. He treated the relationship as something closer to a father and son dynamic than a standard employer and employee contract. That depth of personal trust is precisely what makes this the deepest cut on the entire list, the wound that sits beneath all the others. In October 1996, Bret Hart signed a 20-year contract with the WWF 20 years. This was not a routine business deal. It was a commitment designed to cover the rest of his working life in professional wrestling. It said, "You built this company with your body and your craft and your years, and we value that permanently. We will take care of you." Bret felt genuinely secure for the first time in years. He felt like the loyalty he had poured into that organization for over a decade had finally been formally and permanently recognized in the most meaningful way imaginable. Less than 1 year later, Vince called him in and told him he intended to breach the contract, not renegotiate the terms, not ask for a conversation about adjustments, breach it deliberately and intentionally because he said he could no longer afford the payments he had promised. Bret has described that moment with real and visible pain every time he tells it. He said it felt like being an old prisoner in a cell who was suddenly being told the prison did not want him there anymore. After everything he had given, after turning down other opportunities to stay loyal, he was being pushed out of the place he had devoted his career to building. That breach was the direct chain that led to Montreal. Bret was heading to WCW to secure the financial future the WWF could no longer provide. But before he left, the matter of the championship had to be addressed. Bret was the WWF champion. He had never refused to do what was asked of him as a performer throughout his entire time with the company. He was a company man by every definition. What he asked for in return was modest. Do not have him lose the title in front of a Canadian audience in his home country. Let him leave with his dignity where it meant the most. Vince McMahon told him he could drop the belt any way he wanted. He could even forfeit the championship entirely on his own terms without it being taken from him in a match. Those words, Bret has stated clearly and on record numerous times, came directly and unmistakably out of Vince McMahon's mouth. Bret believed them completely. He should not have. The bell rang during the Survivor Series main event in Montreal while Bret was locked inside his own finishing hold. The match was stopped. The title was handed away. He had been double-crossed on live pay-per-view in front of the entire world. He stood in that ring and made his feelings completely visible to every camera in the building in a moment that nobody watching could misinterpret. Then came the line that still registers as the deepest personal cut of the entire saga. Vince McMahon said, "Bret screwed Bret." He took the betrayal he had personally planned and orchestrated and reversed the direction of it entirely, placing the blame on the man he had just deceived. To Bret, that is the ultimate act of gaslighting against someone who had given absolutely everything they had to a company and a person they genuinely believed in and trusted with their professional future. He punched Vince McMahon backstage that night. He has never apologized for it. The bitterness deepened significantly in 1999. That was the year Owen Hart, Bret's younger brother, died in a terrible terrible and tragic accident during a live WWF pay-per-view event. It was one of the most devastating losses Bret has ever had to carry as a human being. He has since said he believes Vince had very little direct personal responsibility for what happened to Owen that night, but he remains deeply critical of a corporate vision where business considerations consistently seem to come before the well-being and safety of the performers who built everything with their bodies and their careers. His various reconciliations with Vince over the following years were never built on complete forgiveness. Bret has been honest about that. Part of his motivation, he has acknowledged openly, was protecting his own legacy. He did not want to be erased from a history that Vince effectively controlled and shaped. That is not reconciliation born from warmth or changed feelings about what happened. That is a pragmatic decision made by someone who understood very clearly where the power sat. Vince McMahon made Bret Hart a star. He also broke the most important promise he ever made to him and then told the world that the man he betrayed had done it to himself. For Bret, those two things will always exist permanently side by side, and no public gesture changes what happened in Montreal. Montreal broke Bret's trust, but what happened next broke his body. Number 1, Bill Goldberg. This is the entry that sits at the very top of the list. Not because of politics, not because of backstage maneuvering or creative control clauses or contracts breached behind closed doors, because of what happened inside that ring on one specific night in December 1999, and because of everything that was taken away in the moments that followed. On December 19th, 1999, Bret Hart walked into WCW Starrcade to face Bill Goldberg. On paper, it looked like a match that fans had genuinely wanted to see. The technical excellence of the hitman against the raw, explosive power of the man who had built his career on an extraordinary undefeated streak. Two completely different styles meeting in what should have been a memorable and defining encounter for the era. What happened instead was the end of Bret Hart's career as the performer the world had known. Goldberg threw a thrust kick. It connected at the base of Bret's skull, just behind the right ear. Goldberg had reportedly called out a warning before the kick arrived, shouting, "Watch the kick," as Bret came off the ropes. But the spatial awareness was not there. The control was not there. The kick landed stiff, hard, and in precisely the wrong place. Bret has described what it felt like in terms that stay with you. He says it was like being hit across the back of the head with a hockey stick. A massive, solid, undeniable impact, and then a kind of heavy fog settled immediately over everything. Not quite pain in the way pain usually presents itself. Something heavier and more disorienting than that. A thick, unstable blur that did not lift when he tried to shake it away and find clarity. He finished the match. That is who Bret Hart was. A professional to his core, every single time. But when it was over, something was clearly and seriously wrong with him. He was pale-faced and unsteady. He was drifting through conversations without being fully present. The world around him was not connecting the way it should. In the days that followed, he pushed through it the way wrestlers of his generation always pushed through physical damage, masking the symptoms with far too much Advil, telling himself it would clear with rest and time. It did not clear. It got worse with every passing day. A doctor examined him and found a hole in the neck muscle, the size of a quarter, caused by the direct force of that kick. The concussion was real, serious, and lasting. And Bret, against any reasonable medical guidance available to him, wrestled 5 more matches in the weeks after Starrcade. Every one of those matches added further damage to an injury that had already crossed the point from which there was no coming back to who he had been before. Think about what that actually means. 5 matches with a career-ending concussion, still trying to deliver, still trying to honor the commitments he had made to promoters and audiences, because that was who Bret Hart was. The professional in him could not stop even when his body was telling him in every possible way that it needed to stop. By the time medical reality could no longer be pushed aside, the damage was done, and it was permanent. 5 matches that should never have happened, and all of them traced back to one kick from a man who had not done the preparation required to throw it safely. The financial reality of what that single kick erased is genuinely staggering. Bret estimates the direct loss at $16 million. That is what remained on his WCW contract at the moment the injury occurred. Gone, effectively, because of one moment of poor spatial awareness and inadequate technique from the man across the ring. Beyond the contract itself, the broader termination of the WCW arrangement added roughly another $6 million in losses on top of that figure. Together, somewhere in the area of $22 million in guaranteed earnings, taken away in seconds on a December night. But what drives Bret's frustration at 60 is not only the financial loss or the physical damage done back in 1999, it is what he sees in the present. Goldberg never stopped working. He returned to WWE years later and headlined major events across the world. He appeared at the enormous shows held in Saudi Arabia, performing matches that lasted only minutes and collecting paydays that bore no relationship to the brevity or quality quality of the work. And Bret Hart, the man whose career was ended directly and specifically because of him, watched all of it from outside the ring he could no longer occupy as that performer. He has made no effort at all to hide how unjust that disparity feels. The man who cost him $16 million in seconds through negligence was still being paid at the very top of the industry decades after that night. And Bret was not in that ring anymore. Could not be in that ring anymore as the hitman the world had known. Because of that kick, what places Goldberg at the very top of this list is something important to understand clearly. It is not malice. Hogan was selfish and chose to be, deliberately and repeatedly. Shawn was calculating and chose to scheme with full awareness of what he was doing. Triple H was political and chose to maneuver against a colleague without conscience. Vince broke a direct and explicit promise while looking him in the eye. All of those were conscious choices made by people who understood exactly what they were choosing. Goldberg, in Bret's view, was simply not prepared for the level of responsibility that came with competing against performers at the standard Bret represented. He had not been trained to the degree the job required. He lacked the spatial awareness and the technical discipline needed to guarantee the safety of the person across from him. And in this business, in the world Bret Hart was raised in, that is not a forgivable oversight. It is the most fundamental failure possible. Bret has stated it plainly across dozens of interviews and live appearances. Anytime someone does something in that ring that genuinely hurts you, for real, they are in the wrong business. Full stop. No gray area, no exceptions for popularity or drawing power or the size of the paydays they generate. That is the code. And Goldberg broke it in the most permanent and irreversible way imaginable. The man who prided himself on never injuring an opponent in his entire career had his career ended by someone who did not hold that standard to any meaningful degree. That irony does not sit quietly. It sits with Bret Hart every single day. When you stack all 5 names together, the story stops being a list and becomes something far more significant. It becomes a complete and sustained statement about what professional wrestling is supposed to be and what it became when the people around it stopped honoring those founding values. Hulk Hogan was the biggest star the sport had ever produced. When the moment came to pass that on to the next generation, he refused without hesitation or visible regret. He chose his own position over the future of the company he claimed to love. For Bret, that is a fundamental violation of the duty every veteran owes to the people in line behind them. Shawn Michaels was the only peer Bret respected completely as a ring worker, and he used that standing to drag personal warfare into the public eye, cross lines that had nothing to do with the craft of wrestling, and then plot a double cross while presenting himself as someone operating in good faith. A 2010 reconciliation could not fully undo what was done in 1997, and Bret has never suggested otherwise. Triple H used proximity to power as a replacement for the craft itself, then consolidated that power through political maneuvering and used it to help end the career of the man he had outmaneuvered. He represents, in Bret's view, the moment when working your way to the top stopped being about the work at all. Vince McMahon made a 20-year promise and broke it in under 12 months. Then, when confronted with what he had done, he reversed the betrayal and placed it on the man he had just deceived. That is not a business decision. That is a personal wound dressed up in the language of business. Goldberg was simply not prepared to share a ring at the level he was placed in. He lacked the foundation the job demanded. The cost of that was Bret Hart's career, his health, and $22 million that will never come back. 5 violations, 5 men, safety, loyalty, merit, trust, craft, 1 code, broken 5 different ways across 1 extraordinary career. Bret has been called bitter for a long time. People say he should have moved on, that carrying these grudges so publicly and for so long only diminishes the legacy rather than protecting it. And perhaps there is something real in that view. Perhaps some of the anger has grown heavier across the years in ways that are not always entirely proportionate to the original events that caused them. But there is another way to read the whole story entirely. Bret Hart never changed his standard. Through every political fight and every broken promise and every career-altering injury, the code never moved. He knew what the business was supposed to be and how it was supposed to be done. And he spent 60 years watching the distance grow between that ideal and the reality around him. He never made peace with that distance. He was not built to make peace with things he considered genuinely wrong and worthy of being named out loud. The matches he left behind are still there, still being watched and studied and discussed by people who care seriously about the craft. The WrestleMania 13 encounter with Steve Austin remains one of the most examined pieces of storytelling the sport has ever produced. 2 men telling a perfect story through the physical language of wrestling, flipping the moral alignment of both characters simultaneously in a single match, leaving the audience in a place they had not expected to be when the night started. That is what Bret Hart was capable of. That is the standard he held himself to every time he walked through a curtain. He also helped build an understanding in a generation of performers that making an audience believe something is real does not require actually hurting the person across from you. That excellence lives in the detail and the discipline. That the safety of your opponent is not a secondary consideration you address after everything else. It is the foundation. Without it, nothing else built on top of it has any genuine value. The 5 people on this list represent moments where that foundation was undermined or abandoned entirely. And Bret Hart is not willing to pretend that did not happen, not at 40, not at 50, and certainly not at 60, standing on a stage in front of audiences who are still there and still want to hear every word. Were every one of his grudges perfectly and entirely fair? That is worth sitting with, honestly, for anyone who cares about this history. Wrestling history is full of competing accounts and competing versions of the same events. Every person on this list has their own account of what happened and their own justification for the decisions they made. That tension between versions is part of what makes this era of the business so endlessly compelling and so worth revisiting. What is beyond any real debate is this: Bret Hart gave everything he had to professional wrestling over the full length of his career. He did it with extraordinary skill, extraordinary care for his opponents, and complete and unwavering conviction about what the art form could and should be. Whatever was taken from him along the way, that record stands entirely on its own. The best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. Those words meant something real. And at 60 years old, he is still making sure you know exactly who he believes disagreed with that and why it matters. If you enjoyed this one, drop a comment below with who you think deserved to be on this list and why. And if you want more stories like this, you know exactly what to do. Subscribe and stick around. There are plenty more names still to talk about.